Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over map, which is an array method in JavaScript. I've split up all of these array methods into 3 separate videos, each with their own set of exercises, specifically for map, filter, and reduce. The reason for this and splitting it even further up from the basics array exercises that we looked at before was that these functions or methods on arrays are used so often everywhere in the world of web development and just JavaScript development in general that they really deserve their own videos. So what we're going to go through is the kind of in-depth version of how these work behind the scenes, and then we're actually going to go through a series of exercises for each of them. So let's just get right into map. Okay, so for map, the main thing to keep in mind for map is that this is a method that works with arrays in JavaScript. Okay, that means that it doesn't work on any other data type. It only works on arrays. So given that we have an array, we can map over it and do this map thing, whatever that is. Just keep in mind as we learn other data types, just like we learned about strings and numbers and things like that in primitive types, this function map or method map only works on arrays. Okay, so that's it. I have a diagram here, and there's quite a lot going on. You've probably been staring at this while I've been yapping away. Let's not get too intimidated by this. I'm going to break it down, and I really hope that this actually helps make this easier to understand instead of more complicated. So I'd like to kind of start with this area right here on the very left-hand side, where I have declared a variable called big cities, and that's taking cities and then doing this dot map thing over it. So before we even get into any of this, I want you to look at something interesting right here. So I'm just going to use my mouse to kind of denote this. You can see that we have a function inside of this map thing. We have a function. This function has one parameter. It looks like it's called city, and it's an arrow function. And it has one line of code inside of it, right? In between these curly brackets, there's this one line of code that says return city dot to uppercase. Okay, so what is happening here? So ignore all the rest of this crazy diagram. Let's just kind of zoom in on this little aspect. So if you focus on this arrow function right here, we are taking some variable, some argument, and we're calling it city, and we're returning city.toUppercase. Now, if you've done some JavaScript before with strings, you might have noticed that toUppercase is a method that works on strings. So in this case, I'll just let you know that, and we can kind of look through documentation like MDN or just on Google for how we would do this with strings. And if you look at toUppercase with JavaScript, you can see how this works. But effectively, if we have a string and then we call dot to uppercase, which is a method on strings, on that string, we get back, or we evaluate that string as its uppercase version. Okay, so if I give it hello, I get back uppercase hello, right, with capital HELLO. So this function can be said to basically be an uppercasing function. We give it some string and it gives us back the uppercase version of that string, right? Pretty simple. Note though that this returns back that uppercase version. It doesn't just console log it out. It doesn't like do some other thing with it and not return anything. It actually returns this uppercased string in this case. Okay, so with kind of that out of the way, I'd like to actually zoom back out really quick. I know it feels like I'm jumping around, but I tried to make this kind of follow a flow. Let's see if this works out. I'd like to pull up Google. And again, always ignore these random trending searches that pops up. But we want to search for map in JavaScript. And the reason I'm doing this is because a lot of this stuff can be Googled. And I want to focus on the stuff that's more of the explanation that cannot be Googled. So if we Google for JavaScript map, we'll kind of have some interesting things. Later on, we're actually going to look at this thing, which is a map in JavaScript, which is different from what we're looking at right now, which I also know is also called map. We are looking at the array map method. There is a data structure called a map in JavaScript as well, which we're going to learn later. But for now, let's focus on this array map. And you can see kind of this is denoted by this array.prototype.map. You can ignore prototype for now. That's a bit more advanced, and we'll get to that in future videos. But just keep in mind, we want to look at arrays map, not the map data structure. I'm going to use the MDN documentation for this. Feel free to use any other docs, but for this video, I'm just going to use MDN because I believe that they're most comprehensive. So let me zoom in on this a tiny bit. So we can see array.prototype.map. Map is a method that creates a new array. You can see that they put this in bold, right? It creates a new array populated with the results of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array. Now that sounds like a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo, right? So what does this actually mean? So you can see right here that they actually have a demo of this. They have an array right here called array1, which is pointing to an array with 4 numbers. And then we're saying pass a function to map. So we're calling a variable called map1, and we're pointing it at whatever comes back from array1.map. So we're doing a .map on this. And then it looks like we're doing this weird thing here. What is this? This is actually a shorthand for functions. We haven't gone through this yet, but we'll start to see it pop up more and more because it's not really worth spending just an entire video on this. If you don't have if you only have one parameter, in a function, an arrow function specifically, you can actually omit the parentheses around it. And if you only have one line of code in the function and you want to return that thing, you can actually just eliminate the curly brackets. But I don't want to go too far down that route. I just want to focus on what this does. This is saying a function that has x and it returns x times 2. So if we were to give it the number 5, it would return 5 times 2 because 5 would be the argument to that function and it would replace the parameter x, so we would get back 10. So in this case, you can see that if we log out the result of this, we end up getting 2, 8, 18, and 32 if we map over array1 with this function. Okay, so another way to say this in English, and we're going to go through my example again in a second to really reinforce this, is if we have an array, the map method on that array allows us to apply a function to each element in that array, one at a time. And we get back a copy or a brand new array that doesn't modify the original array at all. It's a brand new set of items. Okay, in a different location in memory, which we'll also see. Okay, so to really reinforce that, let's come back to kind of this code right here, and then we'll kind of go through this diagram to really put it together. I'm saying that we have a variable called big cities, and big cities is going to point at whatever is evaluated by taking cities, which is this array right here, and we are calling .map on it. I just put this onto multiple lines so it fits on my screen. And we are providing map a function. This function takes one parameter for now, but we can see how we'll take many parameters in future videos, such as the index and other things. But the most important thing is that it takes the first parameter, which is the item. City, in this particular example, is going to be each element in this array, one at a time, that we're going to use this function here to apply to that element. So what we're saying is map over cities. So basically loop over cities, one element at a time, and then replace the city parameter with that item one at a time, which will be the actual arguments to the function. And this is handled automatically for us by map. And whatever we return in that function is going to get put into that slot in the new array. That's a copy of the old array, which doesn't modify the old array. So if we look at this, we're saying take cities, which is London, Vancouver, Mumbai, and New York, all as strings, and apply map to it by giving it this function. And this function, as we said, is an uppercasing function where it takes a value and it returns the uppercase version of that value. And we are applying it, this is what these arrows are denoting, to that string one at a time and putting it in the same index, in the same slot, but in a brand new array. So what effectively happens is big cities is going to look like this once this map is complete. We're going to get each string in the same spot, in the same index, after that transformation function has been applied to it, in this case uppercase, with the indexes being the same. Okay, so you can think of map as transforming an array using a function on each element in that array. And most critically, we get back a new array. So to really hone that last point in, I just have one more drawing I want to show you before we look at the code, which is this drawing. Let's say we have a variable called animals that points at an array of strings, which are animals in this case. That would be this part right here of the diagram that I have highlighted. Right, we have monkey, dog, cat, and koala, right? Indexes 0, 1, 2, and 3 respectively, which is what animals is pointing at. If we were to map over this animals array, and you can see this function is very similar to the previous function, I just changed the name of the parameter because the parameter name doesn't really matter. It's going to take each item, in this case denoted as animal, and it's going to return that item, animal, dot to uppercase. Okay, so big animals is going to point to whatever we get back from mapping over the animals array and applying this uppercasing function to each element. And we're going to get back a copy of that array in a new memory location. So you can see that the map creates this array down here, which I've denoted in blue, called big animals, which has its own indexes, its own space of memory, and every element has been uppercased. What we did not do was change this animals array in that process. The original animals array has been untouched. This is a feature of functional programming that can guarantee us that whatever we do with these variables and whatever they're pointing at are not going to change. Okay, so we are creating a copy of animals and then doing this uppercasing on it so that we don't accidentally mess around with the original animals array. This has a lot of uses. In fact, so many uses, and this pattern is so important that it comes up in the most popular frameworks such as React. And we're going to see it again and again and again. This is why I'm really spending extra time repeating it and kind of explaining it in as much detail as I can. So let's look at the code for this and see how it works. I'm just going to pull up Visual Studio Code. I have a folder open for kind of this project. I'm just going to create a new file for this. I'm going to call it map-intro.js. Just zoom in a tiny bit more for this one. And I want to create an array to start. So I'm going to say const numbers is equal to an array, and I'm just going to put some numbers in here. I'll just say 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. Okay. So let's say I want to create another array, and this, let's call it times 2, or let's call it times 10, just so it's a bit more clear what's happening. And I'm going to say that I want to take numbers, which is pointing to this array right here, and I'm going to map over it and create a new array. So I'm going to say numbers.map, and map is a method or a function that only works with arrays. So we can only put an array here on the left-hand side of .map. That's what that means. We can't put other types of values like strings or objects that we're going to learn later or other things in there. We can only use arrays with map. And map has one parameter, one argument that we have to pass it, and that's the function we want to run on each item in the array. So by default, usually what I do with map is I put in an arrow function just like this. Okay, so what I've done inside of map is I've given it an arrow function in line as its argument. Okay, this is an empty arrow function. Okay, quite concise. And the way that map works is it gives us a few arguments right away when it gets called. So when the map function runs on numbers, we get technically 3 different arguments given to us. The most important one is the first one. I'm going to call this number, singular. Okay. Usually you're going to see this pattern where you're going to have something that's plural for the array and then something that's singular for what you want to map over, because we're doing one element at a time. So just to be extra clear, number is going to be given to us by map. It's going to start at 5, then it's going to go to 10, then it's going to go to 15, then it's going to go to 20, then it's going to go to 25. This function is going to be called 5 times because I have 5 numbers. If I change the number of items in numbers, this would get called that many more times. Okay, so I'm just going to give myself some room here. I'm going to put an enter in here just so I have more space to write some code. We'll see ways to shorten this later like they did in the MDN example. But the most important thing with map is we want to return back the value we want in that spot for that item. Okay, so let's say I want to multiply each number by 10. I would want to return back. This is the most important part, and I'll show you what happens if we forget this in a second. We want to return back that number, which is the argument, which gets passed to us. Right now it's just a parameter because it's a placeholder. And I want to multiply it by 10. Okay, so the way to read this, and we'll console log this out in a second and run it, is I have an arrow function that has one parameter called number, and this function's job is to return that number multiplied by 10. We saw this in the functions video. The only difference here is that we're using this special map method that works on arrays, and we're giving it this function that we created as an argument. Map knows to call this function one time for every single element in the array. And it's going to take the return value and put it into a new array. And then at the end, we're going to have a new array with that function being called for every item in the old array. So in this case, we're going to start with 5. We're going to return 50. So the first round of map is going to look like this. We're going to have 50. Then we're going to come back around like a loop, and we're going to call number, and this time it's going to be 10, right? So it's going to be 10 times 10, which is 100, right? Then we're going to come around, 15 times 10, 150. Then one more time, 20 times 10, 200, and then a final kind of wrap around a loop, and we're going to call our function one last time with 25, since that's the last element in the numbers array, and we're going to get 250. And then the map will stop, and we will end up with this array. So this side, the right hand side of this statement, is going to end up as this array, which is a brand new array, and we are assigning that to times 10. So then we're saying times 10 is equal to that. That's what's happening. Okay, so this side literally turns into this array. Okay, so I'm going to console log times 10, and I'm going to run this code, and let's see what we get. So I'm going to make sure I'm in the right folder. I'm going to run node and then map intro, and then you can see that we get exactly what I mentioned earlier: 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. Okay, and this is because we're calling this function, times 10 function, on this array 5 times and creating a new array. Okay, if I log out numbers, we can see that it is going to remain unchanged. Nothing happened to numbers. Numbers is still 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. The first log is the new array that we get. Okay, so that's the most important part of map, and this is how fundamentally map works behind the scenes. Now, I want to show you one of the common mistakes that happens when you start using map. This still happens to me because I always forget to do this once in a while, but I've hammered it into my brain so many times that I want to share it with you. I'm going to create another file to demo this. I'm going to call this map return.js. Okay, I'm just going to copy this array here just so that we have the same array. In fact, I'm actually going to copy all of this code. I'm going to put it in here. Okay, so just to kind of recap this, we have an array called numbers, 5 numbers. We're creating a new variable pointing it at this numbers array, which we're mapping over and providing it this function that we wrote in line. This function takes one argument and then returns that argument times 10. Okay, so we saw the result of that. Now, what happens if we forget to return? Okay, I want you to think about this for a second. And the hint I'm going to give you is that think about what a function returns by default in JavaScript if we don't provide it an explicit return statement. We covered this in the functions video. Just give you a moment to think about that. Okay, so I'll remove this and I'll just maybe console.log this out. Maybe I just kind of want to see what happens if I multiply that by 10. But most importantly, we don't have to console log it out. We can do other stuff. But most importantly, we're not going to return anything. Okay, this function here has no return statement. All right, so I'm going to console log out times 10. We're going to see something really interesting. So I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to run node map return. And look at that. So there's kind of a lot going on here. So let's kind of take it really slow and just kind of parse this out together. We are mapping over numbers, which is this array. And we're calling this arrow function one time for every single element in that array. Inside of this function, we have a console log where we're taking the argument and we're multiplying it by 10 and logging it out. So this seems to check out, right? This is kind of proving to us that we're kind of looping over this numbers array one at a time and then like doing stuff with it, running code, right? So this 50 is coming from this line 4. So same with 100, 150, 200, 250. Okay, we're just logging it out. However, if we look at the result of this map, so times 10, which is what we're interested in, line 7, right? We can see that the resulting array is an array of 5 undefineds. The reason for this is that by default, every single function in JavaScript that doesn't return a value explicitly is going to return undefined by default automatically by JavaScript behind the scenes. Okay, so if we don't provide a return value, JavaScript is going to return undefined. Every function. So technically what's happening behind the scenes, just to be extra clear, is this. We are returning something. We're just returning the undefined value, which is one of the primitive types. Probably not what we want. Okay, and the reason there's 5 is because our array has 5 items in it, right? We run this function once for every single item. If I added a 6th item, let's say 30, and I ran this again, you'll see that now we have 6 undefineds. And we get the 300 being printed out because it's being executed in a console log for a 6th time. Okay, so be really, really careful with map and how you're returning things inside the map function. This is probably the most common thing that comes up, and it'll cause endless amounts of bugs, especially as you start using this more and more in some of the more modern frameworks. Okay, so given that this is such an important topic, what I've done is created an exercise video where we're really going to hammer into this and get into some more complex examples together for some practice. Highly encourage you to join me in that video. If you enjoyed this video or you had any questions, please post them in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. What we're going to do in the video after this exercise video that I just mentioned is we're going to go through the next function that is a functional method on arrays called filter. Okay, and filter is really awesome. We can actually combine these in really, really awesome ways. I can't wait to get to that video as well after we get to the problem sets for the map function. I'll see you in either of those videos.